here. We're just going to call it authenticate. Authenticate. Here, we're just going to call it authenticate. Authenticate. Here, we're just going to call it authenticate. User. There we go. And we're just going to pass in that function name, which we'll create up here as a function called authenticate user. And actually, to make this easier on ourselves, we're actually going to put this authenticate user function inside of our initialize function. We'll just make it an arrow function. And this authenticate user function is going to take in a few different parameters. The first parameter that this is going to take in is going to be the email. In our case, this is the username field. Next thing is going to be our password. And lastly, it's a done function. Essentially, we're going to call this whenever we're done authenticating our user. So now that we have that done, we have our passport.use set up. The next thing we need to do is set up passport for serializing our user. So we can just come in here, serialize user, and inside of here, we're going to take a function, which is going to take a user, and it's going to take a done. And this is going to serialize our user to store inside of the session. And we need to have a function which is going to do the exact opposite of deserializing our user. And this is again going to take in here an ID and done, because we're going to serialize our user as a single ID. Now let's work on our authenticate user function, because this is essentially what we're going to call from our login using our email password to make sure our user is correct. So the first thing we want to do is get our user by email. So we can just create a user here, and we're just going to say that this is going to be get user by email. And we're going to pass in the email. This is a function that we're going to create, but we don't have to worry about it right now. We just know that this is going to return us a user by email, or it's going to return null if there is no email for that user. So we want to check to make sure that we actually have a user. So we can say if our user is null, then we, for some reason, cannot find the user and we want to return. So we can just say return done, which is this function we need to call every time we're done. And the first parameter is the error. In our case, we don't have an error because the error would be if something went wrong on your server. And in our case, there is no error on the server. The next thing we need to do is we need to return the user we found. In our case, we found no user, so we'll return false. And we can also return a message, which will be displayed. This is essentially our error message. And we can just say no user with that email. There we go. And now that we know if we get past this if statement that we actually have a user, what we can do is we can actually try to make sure that the user's password matches this password that's passed in here. And to do that, we're going to need bcrypt. So let's make sure we take in bcrypt by using the require statement, require. And we want to require that bcrypt library just like that. And then down here, this is again asynchronous. So we're going to wrap this inside of a try catch. And inside of the try portion of this try catch, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we check by awaiting our bcrypt dot compare. And the first thing we want to pass in is the password that the user sent in with the login form, which is this password. And we want to compare that to our user.password, just like this, password. And if this returns true, then that means that we actually have an authenticated user, so everything returns successfully. But else, if it did not return true, then that means that our user's password did not match. So let's do the bad case first. We're going to return done with no error, and we want to return false here because we don't have a user again, the passwords did not match. And we also want to return a message here, and this message essentially is going to say password incorrect, just like that.